Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where risk, insurance, and geopolitics mix. I'm your host, David Benyon, and welcome to this special episode produced in association with Gallagher Specialty. Our topic is Renewables meet Realpolitik, political violence and terrorism threats to renewable energy projects. My two guests are Harry Walker, Director of Structured Credit and Political Risks at Gallagher Specialty, and Adam Carrier, Head of Consulting at AnotherDay, a Gallagher company. We're really privileged to feature these two guests for this conversation, bringing together broking and consulting expertise. They're also bringing together two closely correlated but distinguishably different parts of the insurance market, both focused on geopolitical risks, and that is political violence and political risk. Our focus will link these two perspectives together by focusing on the assets, renewable energy projects, and on the malicious risk and geopolitical risk environment facing these assets. So that's enough from me. Let's get into it. Harry, let's start with you. Welcome to the pod, and please just tell us what's your focus at Gallagher Specialty.
Yeah, so I work in the Structured Credit and Political Risk team at Gallagher. So we focus on covering trade and investment in primarily emerging and frontier markets, but also in more developed economies as well. I sit within the wider crisis management team, which encompasses political violence, terrorism, and various other classes as well.
And Adam, what's your role at AnotherDay?
So I lead the strategic risk consulting team, AnotherDay. So we're a wholly owned subsidiary that sits in Gallagher Specialty, indeed in the crisis management side of the business as well. So we work quite closely with Harry and the team, trying to translate the risk management elements of what our clients are doing and how they understand their risk, and then translating that and supporting that as it comes then to acquiring the right insurance products to transfer that risk into the insurance market.
In recent days, rare earths have become part of the conversation about Ukraine, whether for ongoing US support for Ukraine or as part of any peace deal with Russia. Of course, that's very much up in the air, but I think more broadly, it just illustrates how prominent rare earths can be in the minds of policymakers. How have governments changed in their thinking, do you think, in terms of thinking about national security strategies and policies for energy and for rare earths?
There's been an awakening, I think, over the last probably 5 years predominantly, just how complex and interdependent kind of global supply chains are, from this sort of the raw materials element all the way up through the value chain to end products. And I think COVID really illustrated that point perfectly. But there's sort of the growing quote unquote Cold War between China and the US, which in an economic sense is actually very hot. It's applied a lot more focus to that and the understanding of just how exposed and vulnerable, in particular, critical Western industries are to geopolitics. You know, and again, the war in Ukraine is a perfect example of that as well, where the defence industrial base in Europe and the US has just not really been able to ramp up production quick enough to support the Ukrainians in the way that they would like and we would all like to support. So I think there's been a lot more of an awakening on that side, which is good. The difficulty, I think, is that particularly for Europe, it's a lot more of a challenge to secure those nationally important, those strategic raw inputs that are not just driving the defence industrial base, but also the green tech revolution as well. You know, the US is in a better position because it's got significant internal domestic rare earth deposits. And so, you know, the DoD, for example, has been investing heavily in building out that domestic capacity to try to wean off its reliance on China, who not only is, you know, the world's biggest provider of rare earths, they also process the vast majority of it as well on behalf of other nations. Now, Europe's in a different position, doesn't have significant deposits of rare earths, and is trying as hard as it can to, you know, woo African nations and get agreements in place with African nations to access those rare earths, those raw materials. But then it's increasing the exposure to geopolitical tensions within a bloc that doesn't necessarily agree on things like foreign policy in the first place. And so how it continues to try to secure those resources, I think it's going to create compounding problems in the European space, I think.
I think I'd also add that with the Russian war, Europe suddenly realized just how reliant on Russian gas they were in order to run their economies. And when the taps are turned off, you have to work out an alternative. And, we've seen in the UK, in a cold winter, you suddenly start to realize, have we got what we need to run a country? So I think we're not just talking about security from a sort of defense perspective, it's security in terms of actually running your economy, and domestic policy relies on it.
Yeah. The title to the podcast, Renewables meets Realpolitik, that challenge that Harry's just raised there comes into real sharp focus for countries like Germany, for example, that's turned off a lot of its nuclear production facilities, relies significantly on coal-based power to the grid. And so, yes, the German population, the German government would love to move towards a more renewable and sustainable energy grid. But the realities of the situation is that they're just not able to bridge that gap without significant fossil fuels.
So if you've got, governments thinking more strategically and I assume sort of forming relationships that are aimed at securing supply chains and supply of rare earths and making sure there is energy security, is that changing the relationships between government and industry?
Absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, it's industry that's going to have to deliver these changes to the energy mix and deliver these raw materials, right? It's not something that governments are going to be able to do purely on the national level. And so it's kind of, how do you go about doing that? And as I said before, in the US, it's a lot easier because they can look domestically to start to ramp that production up. They can also look into South America, places like Chile, etc., that are a lot closer to home. For Europe, that closest base for those raw materials is in Africa. And so, unfortunately, companies and investors that are going to go into those emerging markets need a lot of government infrastructure and support around them to make that a success. But we're in a position where the significant European powers, us included, have been spending less and less and less year on year in terms of things like foreign outreach, foreign Commonwealth Office, the Development Office, etc. So just at the point where we need industry in those markets doing more, we're not anywhere near as engaged politically in those environments as we were in the past. And we also fundamentally, as Europeans, have a lot less to sell to those countries in comparison to China and Russia, who are much more bullish on supporting those local governments, or the US, again, that has a huge domestic market that they can, provide access to as part of their leverage. Harry, I guess this is something that you're seeing on the coalface as well from clients. What are you seeing that clients are sort of facing into when they're trying to, gain access to these markets and where they need government?
You're right in that if you want to take shortcuts in investing in emerging markets, and let's talk about Africa, Russia and China will probably give you what you want and not ask too many questions about what you're doing with it. For the better, UK, European, North American, Australasian clients have better standards in terms of that. But really, I think the more that the UK slips in the rankings in terms of being able to put soft pressure and provide proper investment into these countries, it makes it all the more difficult for companies trying to actually put the money in.
Harry, I sometimes think political risk, political violence, for the layman, they can sound almost like the same thing. But at least in this room, we know they're not in the insurance market terms. But I sometimes feel the PVT market can be easier to grasp the man on the street or the woman on the street because it's protecting the physical assets. It's physical damage, it's property. It's things like sabotage or terrorism, or strikes, right, civil commotion, that kind of thing. Whereas what you do, I think, requires a little bit more explanation sometimes.
Yeah.
So who are the client types for our topic today, talking about these renewables projects? Who are the client types that are typically buying political risk insurance? And as a consequence of who they are, what is it they're seeking to protect?
The product in general covers a huge amount of different sectors and clients. So, the big buyers in the market are banks, funds, manufacturers, corporates, traders, all sorts really. But I suppose as it's sort of specifically for renewables projects, you could sort of split it into two. One being obviously the companies that are developing and operating the assets, and then the companies that are providing the finance to develop the assets. So, on the finance side, we're looking at banks and funds, really, and they provide loans to the companies in order to develop the assets. And we cover the banks and the funds for the sort of non-repayment of that loan as a result of a political risk peril.
This is power purchase agreements.
So under our policies, one of the main threats that they're concerned about is the offtake risk, because obviously that ensures that it's going to be economically viable. On the big projects, they tend to be PPAs paying into the grid. So you're taking marginal credit risk on state utilities, which is not particularly desirable. So in our policies, we can come up with ways to try and cover that. If they're, decent strength, we might be able to look at a sort of non-payment policy. But on those that are really quite marginal, we look at something called arbitration award default, which means that there's non-payment under your PPA, and then you follow the disputes mechanism. It takes you to arbitration, and at arbitration, if it's found in favour of you and you still don't receive any money, then insurers would pay out. So there are ways we can cover that. So yes, definitely PPAs are one of the reasons why people might come to our market.
Harry, I interrupted you earlier about PPAs, and you were talking more broadly about how you might classify political risk buyers into different constituent groups, such as between financing and equity owners.
So we have two different types of policy. One is a lender's policy that covers lenders to projects, so that's banks and funds. And then an equity policy, so equity investments into projects. So that could be, again, private equity funds, but it could also be the energy companies themselves.
What's the typical deal size of the deals that you're placing as a political risk broker in this market?
For the political risk policies, we're sort of looking at anywhere from, at the bottom end, sort of $10 million to north of $1 billion. And that would be on a multi-year basis. So we want to cover long horizons to give investors more security. So typically that would cover an election cycle, so 5 years preferably.
Provided the local government is still the same local government in 5 years' time.
Yeah, there have been a few of those coups and,
Yeah, well, I'm always interested in the crossover between political risk and political violence. And I mean, there are many reasons why an investor might not get paid. Obviously, expropriation, sort of core to political risk insurance. But I mean, if the asset has been destroyed, potentially that's the reason why the investor might not get paid. So is that where there's a bit of crossover?
Yeah, so there is confusion between the two classes. And to be honest, it's silly that the names are so similar. I don't know who came up with that.
Well, I had to call the podcast one or the other.
Yeah.
And the acronyms get longer and longer. So
they do.
The war, political violence and terrorism, brackets, non-marine.
Yeah. So essentially, the PV market, the standalone PV market, as you said, quite straightforward to understand on a sort of simple level, physical damage to property, and you get the repair or replacement cost. Essentially, it's the payout. The political risk market, it can cover PV. It can also be purchased in conjunction with a standalone political violence policy. So, we would typically include political violence in our political risk policies. The client you're covering is potentially slightly different, and also the peril that you're covering is slightly different. So the PV policy would typically be taken out by the local project company, whereas the political violence covered under our political risk policy would be typically purchased through the topco.
So that's the banks or the funds invested in the project?
It doesn't have to be. So if they're providing debt, they would be their own insured. But we could just be looking at a developer who owns the project, but they might set up an SPV locally to run the project. And that project company tends to do its own, insurance. But we're talking about equity investment, which comes from higher up. And so it's that which they're concerned about investing overseas into a specific company.
Where are we seeing these renewable energy projects taking place that carry significant malicious risk, whether that's PVT, political or geopolitical risks?
Historically, it's our bread and butter is focusing on sort of the more difficult parts of the world. So anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, Middle East, North Africa, parts of Latin America. But yeah, probably our largest exposure is in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are places now which are sort of getting to the point of uninsurable. You know, we'd probably say places like Mali are now getting that way. And we're probably starting to see more of a spread of risks. So, you know, seeing more in Central Eastern Europe. So, yeah, I suppose as the world has become a more fractious place, so the sort of scope to cover these assets grows.
On our side, North Africa in particular, from a renewables perspective, you know, there's access into the European market there and you know, a significant amount of land that can be given over to things like solar PV in particular. Now, how the infrastructure would then work to provide that energy into Europe, that's something that's going to take years and years to develop fully. You know, how you transmit that electricity to where it needs to go, you know, the battery technology, the undersea cabling, etc., that might be required. But that's definitely an interesting space.
When we've talked before, Algeria came up, Tunisia, Morocco. Is there something called the
X-Link
project in Morocco?
That's right, yeah.
And Egypt's got a huge project called Benban for solar.
It's quite interesting from our perspective, looking more on the sort of political violence side, because these projects face into similar risks that, you know, 15, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, to be honest, you know, the big oil and gas majors have all been facing into as well. It's how do you invest in that asset and how do you operate that asset in a way that's going to mitigate your threats? So if you look at a couple of specific examples, solar PV requires a significant amount of water to run. And so while places in North Africa are great because it's sunny all of the time, accessing that water table and diverting those water resources from tribal groups, local communities that are already struggling to maintain a subsistence lifestyle, it creates risk, right? You've got to be able to engage with those communities in a meaningful way to make sure that they aren't left behind and that huge investment in a solar PV plant or whatever it might be doesn't detrimentally affect them to the point where they start to target that facility, become embroiled in political violence against the entities that are involved in that.
So what's the PV you're talking about there? So
solar PV, photovoltaic.
Yeah, not political violence.
No. Yeah, solar political violence. Yeah, that'd be,
the wheels are turning.
Yeah, you know, a really good example of this on the gas side is Total in Mozambique, operating the LNG fields in northern Mozambique. A significant amount of the reasons behind the insurgency in northern Mozambique is because they transferred a lot of foreign workers in to create those LNG fields and operate them. They didn't invest in education of the local population. They didn't bring jobs to the locals. There's obviously a lot of government corruption involved as well. And before you know it, you've got a very significant proportion of young, what we'd call, quote unquote, fighting age males out of a job, not able to feed their families, and it's a lot easier for those to.
And that's interesting because it's typically one of the main benefits between, you know, seeing a project that's run by the Chinese or run by UK, Europe, whatever, is that the workforce tends to be more from the local population, whereas China ships in huge numbers of Chinese to run their own projects, which creates backlash locally.
They're not seeing the wider benefits to local economies.
Exactly right, and that's why, you know, Chinese nationals are a huge kidnap risk, for example, in Nigeria around the oil fields.
And the London market doesn't see those contracts either, does it?
No. But then, you know, that fundamentally you then have a situation, I'm not saying it was the only factor, but it was certainly a contributing factor to, you know, Palmer being attacked and taken a couple of years ago in northern Mozambique. And so, you know, how companies engage with those local communities is crucially important, not just on that side, but also, you know, if there's a lot of intertribal dynamics in those local areas and you want to engage the local population as part of the workforce, you've got to be very careful as to how you balance the competing priorities and the historic grievances between those community groups. And so almost the best way to protect those assets from those kinds of PV risks is to really understand the human terrain around your investment.
Adam, whether the risk comes from government-backed proxy groups, civil unrest, terrorists, etc., a question for you about understanding the different threat actors involved. What does that mean for you when you're, Adam, when you're doing your threat assessments? How do you go about that process?
We've got a lot of experience in conducting those kinds of assessments. So we kind of, we know where to look online. We keep up to date with the research, etc. And we also spend a lot of our time traveling to these kinds of places to maintain our networks there. But, one of our key intelligence feeds is always expertise on the ground, people that are actually living and operating there, whether they're in government, the military, law enforcement.
What do they consist of, those threat assessments? What's the process?
Initially, it's basically first off identifying who are the main actors in and around that area, both at the state level, the parastate and the terrorist level as well, and also things like organised criminality, which can be fairly significant. Then we understand their intent, their capabilities, and also their opportunities to target those assets in particular. And then that really kind of provides us a bit of a heat map of who do we need to be most concerned about and why, and how can they affect the asset, and therefore what can we do about it. Particularly in these kinds of areas, you've really got to be engaged with locals on the ground to understand those dynamics to a greater degree. It's not something that you can do just via desk-based research because, you're often 6 months behind the curve and you're relying on sort of third-party information. So, yeah, that's really important to us. And then it's about understanding along with the client what does a change in that risk environment look like so that we can respond to it quickly. This can't be a one and done process because, as we look at the news every day, right, there's a new situation that seems to pop up almost out of nowhere if you're not looking at it closely. So you use the DRC as an example. That's been bubbling for a long time. And there was, governments were telling people to sort of leave the area. It's just that us from a few thousand miles away, we just read it in the news once, Goma is half taken by M23.
And just to illustrate the breadth of the threats we're talking about and geographically as well. So most of our conversation thus far has been talking about African countries, MENA, Sub-Saharan Africa as well. But looking closer to home, parts of Europe, for example, but a very different threat environment too. Somewhere like Poland or the Baltics, or any of NATO's eastern flank countries that are sort of close to or bordering on Ukraine and Russia. Yeah, what about there? I mean, is that also somewhere where you're seeing interest, and are there lots of vulnerable solar or wind assets on the ground, battery storage, that kind of thing? And what's the threat?
It's interesting, really. Since the war in Ukraine, there has been a significant uptick in physical sabotage against Western interests. You mentioned the Baltic states and Poland there, but also in Germany, the UK as well. There's been a couple of attributed and unattributed fires and other events, particularly within the defence industrial base, that have been essentially attributed back to either Russian or Russian-backed actors. Less and less in the renewable space, but certainly from a cyber perspective, those infrastructures are being targeted, are being kind of reconnoitred, and sort of the defence is tested on a pretty regular basis.
So it's not just a bit of falling missile debris then?
No, it's been much beyond that. And if you speak to individuals involved from the government side on this, what's reported is very much the tip of a much wider iceberg in terms of that threat. And so, we're back in a kind of peak Cold War era where physical sabotage is something that's happening on a regular basis. A couple of really good examples of this. There's been a couple of fires at munitions factories in the UK recently. The substation where the Atlantic undersea cables come into France around Marseille, they were destroyed. And also DHL and other international shipping companies have been targeted in places like Poland, like you say. So, there's a significant spread there, but you could certainly see, and you wouldn't need to be, Nostradamus to see that as Europe starts to try to focus more on increasing its renewable energy mix and move away from a reliance on LNG, that they can become targets.
Yeah, I mean, the signs have been there for years. There was a story about a large ammunition storage area that went kaboom, and tragically, I think somebody was killed in the Czech Republic.
That's right,
several years ago. But this is before the Titan vendor and before the Ukraine war changed everyone's perspective on the threat that Russia and sabotage. I feel like I might have to change the theme music for this podcast to the Beastie Boys sabotage, because every conversation I have, sabotage comes into it from a different angle.
Definitely,
we
they're
did with the
number
SNIA
one.
conversation and several of the episodes I've done, whether it's maritime or every possible angle.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The government's been putting out more advice around this recently, which shows how seriously they're taking it. But, more broadly, with regards to political violence, those aren't the only groups that are using that. The protest groups, for example, against the Israeli sort of defence supply chain. There's been a number of attacks in the UK for companies that supply the Israeli defence forces.
One
for
in
example.
Bristol, wasn't there?
One in Bristol, one down in Kent as well, I believe, where they gained access to the site, assaulted members of staff and tried to destroy machinery, etc. So, this is a risk that is becoming more prevalent.
Yeah. To go back to a PVT perspective, I think, Adam, let's just talk about some of the typical vulnerabilities, particular to renewables, the assets and the infrastructure on the ground.
Yeah, so it's interesting because with renewables, the supply chains aren't necessarily that much more complex than traditional energy, etc. It's just that the parts for those bits and pieces are manufactured so far away from the places in which they're input. And so there's also a requirement for engineering expertise on those sites. Again, that's no different from other energy types, but it's more novel, and thus it's more in demand and less available. And so those assets themselves, so the physical, whether it's the solar PV panels, the chips and the operational technology that goes around that, the same for things like wind farms, etc. You're having to ship those parts from a significant distance, and then also, similar to a gas pipeline, you've then got to maintain and protect the infrastructure that takes that energy from the point of generation to the point of use. And so, that can be quite difficult. And, one of the other kind of strategic issues on the security side is that fundamentally, renewable energy is a lot cheaper than hydrocarbons. And therefore, the cost-benefit analysis for the security infrastructure around that to protect that site from significant property damage and from being taken over, etc., is less palatable than it would be for an oil field that's potentially making billions of dollars a year. And so, they're often in areas that are difficult to secure in the first place as well. So it's quite challenging from that respect in terms of you're not seeing the same kind of security infrastructure around those positions, those sites, as you would see on an LNG field, for example, or an oil field. But the threats that they face are pretty much the same, and some that we've already kind of discussed. So local groups, local communities that are disenfranchised because of the investment in this area, terrorist groups that we've mentioned previously, and obviously, depending on the locale, other parastatal groups as well, proxy forces from other nations.
If it's a project that doesn't exist yet, it's just sand, it's a desert. Obviously, you've got to think about those local communities and those kind of things. It sounds like very different risk management questions as to something that already exists, and you're just thinking about keeping it secure. So that must mean, I'm guessing, if I was to read some of the threat assessments, it's going to be very different depending on where that project is 5 years away or whether it's something that's been built for.
Yeah, definitely. And you really, investors and companies have to start with their first question should always be, does it need to be here? And that, fundamentally, you need to start with a good understanding of that local environment and how risky is it. And therefore, if it is X level of risk here because of certain factors, terrorist groups, local community issues, political violence, etc., how is that likely realistically to manifest in a way that could compromise our asset? And how much could that cost us? And therefore, actually, are we better off just going somewhere else in the first instance? I'm always a massive proponent first on that community engagement, right? Because you're never going to be able to secure your way out of really negatively affecting the locals, right? Because you're just going to get into a doom spiral where you have to continually invest more and more and more in security. But actually, those competing groups only have to be lucky once. And so investing 10% of that capital that would have gone on that security infrastructure into engaging with local communities can pay a much higher return on investment in terms of your actual general security in that area. The Niger River Delta Avengers are a good example of this in Nigeria and around there. Fundamentally, their reason for existing, or their ostensible reason for existing, is that they feel that local communities do not get enough out of the infrastructure that's there and the foreign direct investment that's put into those areas. And so I'm not saying that community relations are a silver bullet or a panacea, but you can prevent a lot of these issues from arising in the first place. It comes back down to, fundamentally, the counterinsurgency principles that we've understood since the 1950s, 1960s. It's a lot harder to radicalize someone if they have a job and a roof over their head and their kids are in school. There are obviously state-level groups, parastatal groups that have local and geostrategic reasons for targeting these kinds of assets that you're not going to be able to control for in that way. But why open yourself up to even more significant local security threats if you don't have to, fundamentally?
Is geopolitical risk, and headlined by ongoing shifts in US energy policy, displacing climate risk, relatively speaking, in terms of decision-making processes for the energy sector, meaning that fossil fuel projects are actually relatively back in vogue relative to renewables, despite all the environmental costs?
At a meta level, I think what's happened is that the idealism around green energy has been beaten up by reality, which is that, one, there's a huge amount of investment that's still required to get renewables to a position where they can take over the grid. And obviously we've made massive strides in that, and solar PV and wind as part of the energy mix is growing fairly exponentially at this rate, which is fantastic. But they are still variable, right? And so you need to have that baseline input to ensure the economic growth, the economic stability of your nation in things like LNG, unfortunately coal, but to a lesser degree in most nations. And I think we've woken up to the reality that there is a delta between when renewables are going to be able to take over everything on the grid and when we can finally wean ourselves off fossil fuels, and the requirement to maintain that stability in the energy market through the continued use of particularly things like liquid natural gas. And then sort of halfway through that process, everyone realised that, well, if we just turn the taps off for investment and insurance in fossil fuels and we're not building any new capacity, there's going to be a huge gap between what we need to achieve in the long term with renewables versus actually how we keep the lights on in the short to medium term. And I think the war in Ukraine has illustrated that perfectly well, that, Europe wasn't investing in things like LNG infrastructure because it's all coming from Russia and everyone's happy with that situation until something like that happens, and all of a sudden it's the opposite. And we're looking at trying to buy it in from the US, from West Africa, but it's having to come in on ships. And so I think it probably has come back in vogue, but I think it's for reasons that a lot of people were flagging and talking about even 5 to 10 years ago. You can't just turn up the tap of investment to maintain your fossil fuel infrastructure until renewables are in a position where they can take over that part of the energy mix. We're fundamentally living with that poor decision making now, I think.
It's got to be a bit of a transition. I mean, they're obviously heavier polluting hydrocarbons than others, and gas is clearly going to play a part for a while. It depends where you probably are from as well. I mean, Europe doesn't have the fossil fuels and therefore needs to come up with renewable energy infrastructure that far quicker and greater than the US has to, because it has huge oil and gas stocks. So it's very easy for Trump to say, we're just going to go ahead and burn more oil and gas. They can do that, but we in Europe can't.
There's also an issue in the more developing world as well, the global south, which is that our economic development and our lifting of our populations out of poverty was all driven off the back of cheap, reliable, readily available energy from coal, oil and gas. But we're now asking those countries to put their own economic development either on pause or slow it dramatically so that they can transition their grids away from fossil fuels quicker. And so it feels like there's a double standard there, which does create a lot of tensions geopolitically as well, because if you are India, if you are China, if you are Brazil, you're some of the fastest growing economies in the world, certainly more on the sort of India and Brazil side. But you've got pressure from Western countries to say, actually, you've got to decarbonise your grid a lot faster without having the benefits first of being able to take advantage of that cheap, reliable energy. So, I think there's definitely a case as well where it's obviously not a luxury issue because climate change is real and it's here and we're having to deal with it. But we are at a stage in our economies where it is easier for us to make that transition in terms of, the engineering and education and infrastructure and investment that we can make into it. But actually in the global south, they're in a very different position.
ESG is related to all this because obviously the E in ESG most of all, but there's a social and a governance side too in terms of the way that you encourage, like you're saying, working with local communities, for example, on projects. ESG has become such a massive topic in recent years, obviously on the investment side. In what sorts of ways do you think all of this will affect how organisations think about ESG and how they balance it versus what we've talked about, the Realpolitik of renewable energy projects?
It's a good and controversial question, I think. I think businesses need to take a more nuanced view of it. And I think it's difficult, right? Because if you're a business, and particularly if you're operating in the fossil fuel space, your arms are slightly tied in terms of what you can do around ESG because you're fundamentally extracting fossil fuels from the earth and then putting it out into the environment to produce energy. And obviously there's a lot of good things that those companies are doing to divest from that, and the amounts of capital they're investing in things like research and development around green tech, etc. But, it can't be this zero-sum game. And I think investors are recognizing that it's more complex than just saying, well, we're not going to invest or we're not going to expose ourselves to things like fossil fuels, etc., because there's second-order consequences to that as well. If you're pulling investment from fossil fuels in emerging countries, where that money is then going to educating the local population, producing jobs, etc., are you sacrificing the S for the E?
But you've already alluded to this because, like you say, one way to reduce the risk of a new project is, for example, to make sure you do build strong relations with the local communities. But then we've also touched on the idea that if it's, let's say, a Chinese solar development, they're just bringing in their own people. They don't really care about ESG. So conversely, if you're a European energy company, you're having to compete against a rival that doesn't care about ESG. And the other side of it is all that kind of human rights concerns. If you're competing with Russian or Chinese groups, then they can say, well, we don't care about that side of things. So it's just the economics of it.
Well, it's the Realpolitik of it as well, right? It's like, are these values that you actually commit to as a company, and therefore you're willing to lose that competitive edge to Chinese companies or to other countries that don't necessarily put so much value on those aspects? Or is it just corporate virtue signalling in order to maintain your access to capital?
The point is, I don't think it is, because you've said that this is part of the risk profile.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about looking good from an ESG investment perspective. It's if you've got those good, strong relationships on the ground, that's a positive for rating from an insurance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely can be. But if before you've built that asset, if you're competing with other countries, other companies from places like China, for example, depending on the local environment, depending on the local government, they may assign less or more priority to how are you going to benefit the local community versus how are you going to line the pockets of local officials.
Harry, I mean, you're obviously more investor focused as a political risk broker. What's your take on this?
It is a huge focus, and it's something that insurers will ask about when they're looking into a project. Hopefully, if you're looking at a renewables project, the E is probably hopefully taken care of. The social side is very important, and as you said, does have an impact on the security of the site and the way it runs and whether that's efficient or not. I think I'm sort of cynical on ESG in that people will do it if it's been really pushed, and if governments want you to take it seriously, they will make you do it, and your shareholders and board of directors will make sure you implement it. If someone like Trump comes in and says, don't worry about it, you don't need to spend money on trying to do alternatives, just get on with the basics of what you're doing, it will be cheaper.
Just drill, baby, drill.
Yeah. So it's just economics, isn't it? That basically, if you can make more money and not do measures and initiatives to make you environmentally more friendly, you'll do it, probably. Unfortunately, I think a lot of American companies will just crack on with it because it makes sense for profit and therefore shareholders are happy.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose it's just your strategy as a company. I mean, if you take it seriously and if you're interested, you'll keep doing it no matter what. Mm-hmm. But if you are doing it because you have to, well, you'll jettison it as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah.
If what we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration in these very early days is indicative of what we're going to see for the next 4 years, and it is all about drill baby drill, and the US kind of to some degree just exit the stage from renewables.
It's already dropped out of the Paris Agreement.
The subsidies are going, all that stuff. So, and therefore, if there's less investment and interest in investing coming out of the US, then presumably you also lose the kind of security guarantees, because if the US is not there, then the US isn't going to protect its economic interests there. And we've already seen, for example, France withdrawing out of the Sahel. But I guess my question is where this leaves Europeans, because we don't have enormous Anglo-French security forces and bases in parts of Africa. The French obviously have some kind of presence still around bits of Africa, but a lot of, Russian mercenary activity going on. But as you say, it's mostly a Chinese show, isn't it? So does that leave European companies forming relationships with Chinese counterparts? Do we need to basically interact more with China than we might otherwise if the Americans are just not there?
It's quite a difficult balance, I think, because you might not want to deal with China, but at this current moment, particularly on green energy, you have to, because they control a huge amount of the mineral production and the processing. So you might be trying to sort of consciously uncouple or whatever, but it's going to take time. And there are only a few other countries which can start to make up the difference, and it depends where your foreign policy lies in terms of, well, who knows what Trump will do, but I can't imagine he'd take too kindly if the Europeans started to invest more in China and, start trade agreements with them. He will start to put the pressure that way. I mean, in terms of Europe, I think they need to strike their own balance. They need to come up with their strategy. And I think in Africa, they've lost a huge amount of ground, and it's been filled by China, Russia, the Arab states, and it's somewhere which we know well. And yeah, we're falling and falling.
I mean, the Arab states they're not superpowers in like the US or China, but they're managing to forge strategic supply chain.
And they're providing a huge amount of finance.
Exactly, yeah. I think that's the key issue that Harry said there. So they've got a huge amount of capital that they can deploy internationally. Europe doesn't, and Europe doesn't act as one block in a lot of instances. Your point around China, I mean, the Critical Raw Materials Act that Europe has implemented is specifically designed to diversify the supply chain away from China. And so, to Harry's point, it is complex because in the short term, you have to deal with China because they're producing everything for the green tech revolution. You can't build that infrastructure overnight, but you're right. We don't have the soft or the hard power to influence a lot of these nations in Africa. And also, historically, there's a lot of bad blood. There's a lot of history there between former colonial powers in Europe now trying to exert more influence into Africa. I mean, case in point with that was the potential for the Portuguese armed forces to conduct training and deploy into Mozambique to stabilise Mozambique. There was a lot of kind of soul searching around that as it's an ex-colony.
I mean, I wonder whether we might see European countries, UK included, being a little bit more muscular because we're not without hard power, we just don't use it.
Well, for instance, if you think about nuclear power, sources of uranium are very important, and Russia out the game means that we're scrambling to find safe enough places to get it. Now, one of the places France got their uranium was from Niger, and now Niger are forcing the French out of the country. So that's another source of uranium gone. And so trying to find these resources in countries where European countries can deal with and secure their supply chains on that is a very interesting thing.
I totally agree. I think his policies are signalling this era of mercantilism that we haven't seen since pre-World War II. I don't think that Europe really has the decision-making apparatus to make these decisions quick enough and deploy hard and soft power in a way to secure access to those. And so what that does is it creates more of an impetus for Germany, for France, for Italy, for the UK, obviously as outside of the European bloc, to act unilaterally to secure those resources for their own economies. And so, does that start to contribute to more of a fracture within the EU? Does it go back to being more of an economic bloc than this sort of slow slide into federalism?
Just to bring this back to an insurance market perspective and just for commercial clients, it seems to me that because we've got the rug being taken away in terms of, let's say, French withdrawal from parts of Africa, US attention elsewhere, suddenly it shines a light on it. It's like, well, actually, it's a lot riskier than what people thought 10 years ago. And that's why the demand is rising.
Yeah, and prices are rising in most places. I mean, we looked at Burkina Faso 5 years ago, and 5 years later, the price had tripled, I think, and probably now might not be available. And yeah, it's becoming much more difficult to work out what the situation is, I think. And obviously AnotherDay would help with that. But it's just, there's a lot to think about.
Places like Burkina Faso, for example, it remains fluid, right? It's like even if the risk environment is less permissive but kind of stable, what's going on, you can kind of extrapolate out a little bit more what the strategy needs to be to manage that. But Burkina Faso is still, under the control of the military coup. So what does the political process to move away from that look like, and how quickly will it move, and how much is happening behind the scenes? Makes it very, very difficult to predict what the situation will look like in 6 weeks' time, let alone 6 months' time. And that plays into the problem as well, particularly when you're working with companies and investors whose return on investment on these assets is 10, 15, 20 years down the pipe, and you can't really accurately forecast how the political environment is going to look in 6 months. So that does present huge challenges, both up front and on the insurance side.
Thanks for listening to this special episode in association with Gallagher Specialty. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guests, Harry Walker at Gallagher Specialty and Adam Carrier from AnotherDay. Please tune in next time. I'll be back with another episode soon. This podcast was produced by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.